Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
And I'm Brandon Bernstein.
No relation.
Last time on Funny They Don't Look Jewish, Brandon introduced Henry to Marvel Comics' Moon Knight, aka Mark Spector. We looked at Moon Knight Volume 1, number 37, introducing the villain Zohar. We'll pick things up with issue number 38 right now.
So we're going to continue with issue 38, but before we dive with it, I just want to talk about the cover for a moment. I don't know if you saw it, Henry, if you're focusing on the cover. Basically, you have what is probably Moon Knight's father's body wrapped up in shrouds, levitating in front of Moon Knight, looking almost like he's a priest, like a Kohen at the temple, surrounded by candles, and behind them are concentric circles full of text alternating from English and Hebrew language, and then sort of behind that what looks to be an open, almost a Torah scroll. This looks very much to me like an amulet, a sort of Hebrew magical amulet with different letters written around, and I don't know if you can see, Henry, I love this in the lower left-hand part of the circle, written sort of flowing and upside down. You see the letters Yud Hey Vav Hey 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 Hey, which is basically permutations of the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God. In Jewish mysticism, there's often an emphasis, as the contents of this issue will also allude to, an emphasis on different permutations of the letters of God's name arranged in different order, causing different things to happen. But what I love most about this is that it is very clearly Yud Hey Vav Hey, but the second Hey is incomplete because they knew not to write God's name on a comic book cover. It's too accurate. Like, it is not a mess up. That is very clearly a Hey that they didn't finish so that they don't have God's name on a comic cover that would be thrown away. How amazing is that?
That's incredible. Wow, I did not catch that. That's pretty good. Wow. Good job.
It's so well done. It's so beautiful.
I did notice one thing also, just in terms of what it reminded me of. The body of his father actually reminded me of a mummified
Egyptian
corpse. So, I'm not saying it didn't bother me. No. I thought that was a connection between Moon Knight's origin and the Kabbalistic nature of it. Obviously, the body levitating. I think the idea in Egyptian, death, that the corpse is very much on its way to ascending to the next life, and that it's like it's not alive, but it needs to be treated in a way that's respectful or whatever.
Very much so. Yeah, it's and it very much plays with what's about to happen inside. So this issue is called Final Rest. It's almost an identical creative team, except now the colorist is Christie Scheele, but otherwise same team: Alan Zelenetz, Bo Hampton, and all the rest. Henry, if you wouldn't mind, we have the hooded figure is now wearing red rather than purple. He's over Rabbi Spector's body, which has now been removed from the casket. And would you mind reading for us the entirety of what this hooded figure has to say, Henry, starting with Master?
Master, thy soul has shed its skin and ascended the 10 spheres to union with God. Thence hast thou returned to thy disciple with the hidden wisdom of angel and seraph. From thee, Elias Spector, I have learned the Lord's names of power to summon forth the divine spark from within my mortal form. Such secrets must remain mine alone, and none others. Now, as Zohar, I shall illumine truth and scourge the sinful in God's name, bringing atonement and a cleansing to this world.
I love everything about this. Okay, all right, let's go through. My notes are just like, I love this, I love this, I love this. Okay, he talked about his teacher's soul, his master's soul, ascending through 10 spheres. which is clearly an allusion to the 10 Sefirot, which are emanations of God, the same emanations that Batwoman had up in her apartment. So calling them spheres is great. The idea that if you ascend up the Sefirot, on the other side is full union with God. It plays also with this Jewish mystical concept that, as you were mentioning on the cover, Henry, the soul unites with God. And of course also the idea that then you can learn all these secrets. There's a whole genre of literature that we're going to dive into a little bit later, I'm excited to get into, called Hechalot literature or palace literature, that's all about learning different secret passwords, essentially, to gain access to divine mysteries. As it says, it mentions the idea that God's different names have power and allow for magical abilities of sorts. And of course, this villain names himself Zohar, which is the name of the central text of Kabbalah, a book that literally means splendor. And so the fact that he says, as Zohar I shall illumine truth, right? That what does a splendid light do? It illuminates. It's incredible. It's amazing. He's very clearly this misguided figure who's like, people are evil, people are sinful, and I'm going to purify them and make them atone through, heinous acts of my own. But he's basically trying to be an avenging angel. It's incredible.
Yeah, I wonder, is he a villain? It's definitely clearly shown as a villain, but those are all the things you just mentioned are attributes that any vigilante superhero, certainly Ragman, has done and taken on.
Right.
The way he's presented visually and narratively, he's definitely a villain. But I think it's a cool name. I mean, my note here is it says Zohar is a cool name for a villain or a hero.
100. Right. Could go either way. One thing I think both Batman and Ragman and Moon Knight, they're heroes because while they don't act within the confines of the law, they punish people who violate the law. Whereas Zohar seems to be aiming not to punish people who violate civil law, but people who violate what he views as God's law or moral law. And that's where suddenly, at least in the realm of comic books as we're used to, it becomes like, wait, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Interesting reflection on, it's making me think of... the Talmudic edict that...
the
law of the land is the law. But regardless, all right, so Moon Knight goes, and after last issue, he found out this gangster named Curly is the one who hired the young hoodlums to vandalize the Jewish cemetery. So he goes, and we get several pages of a fight between Moon Knight and Curly as Moon Knight is trying to gather information. At one point, he refers to himself saying, "I'm the angel of death, beer belly. You don't want to make me angry." On page 8, we're introduced to a new character, a Mr. Weiss, who teaches at the seminary. And he's dropped by to Rabbi Spector's home, where Marlene is waiting, to arrange to pick up some of the rabbi's books and papers, all of which are being donated to the seminary. Marlene mentions most of these manuscripts are one of a kind, aren't they? So clearly we have the rabbi's unique research, and he has access to a lot of material that is rare, hence why, he's one of the greatest scholars of his time, according to this. On page 9, at the top of the page, Marlene is looking at a picture of Rabbi Spector with his students behind him. I love the fact that it has Rabbi Spector sitting in a chair and all of his students standing behind him.
Why is he in a robe?
That I don't know so much. That might be like artistic license.
Maybe it's the high holidays, and he
could be right before the high holidays.
Yeah.
And who knows? Yeah, he's wearing a kittel. Could be. But I just love the fact that it picked up on traditional Jewish learning from centuries ago. Was that the teacher would sit on the ground, and all of his students would stand around him. And this goes back to Megillah 21a, explaining this, that students learning Torah are reenacting receiving Torah at Sinai, and so they have to be standing as a way of respect to the Torah they're learning, as well as to their teachers. So this image of the teacher seated and everyone else standing in kavod to them, in honor to them, I loved that. And then at the bottom of the page, we see Zohar has snuck into the house and is stealing Rabbi Spector's materials, including an actual scroll, far too small to be a Torah scroll, but it might be like a scroll of Esther or some other
Kabbalistic scroll,
Kabbalistic document. And on page 10, Zohar says, In the name of heaven, do you think Zohar will allow this mystic wisdom to pass into the hands of the sinful and ignorant? Know the divine spark of justice, mortal woman. At which point he blasts her with what looks like almost electricity of some sort.
Yeah, he zaps her.
He zaps her good.
The sound effect is spack.
Right, which love that onomatopoeia. Things I loved about this. He talks about the spark of justice. We already know this is connected to Kabbalah and the Sefirot. One of the 10 Sefirot is Din, or judgment, which is associated with justice, with judgment, with power. And it is also the one of the 10 Sefirot that is most likely to cross the line into evil behavior. There's this whole concept of sitra achar, the other side, this dark side to everything, and Din is always the element of the Godhead that is most likely to tip God over into non-good behavior, into evil behavior. So I love that this villain is considering himself the spark of justice. I love that he shoots out what looks like electricity, because in Ezekiel 1:4, as Ezekiel's having this image of these different angels, one of the things he sees suddenly in this storm coming out of the north is it says, Mitocha ke'ein hachashmal mitoch ha'esh. In the center of it, in the center of the fire, a chashmal, like from some sort of fire. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what this word chashmal means. It ends up being translated as sort of like amber, but years and years later, in more modern times, modern Hebrew linguists decide to use this word chashmal as the Hebrew word for electricity, which of course there wasn't a word for it back in biblical times. Electricity didn't exist. So I just love the fact that there's this mystical Hebrew word that eventually comes to mean electricity, and then he's shooting electricity with mystical powers. That just feels cool to me. All right, on page 12, we have Zohar placing Rabbi Spector's corpse down, and he has written a familiar word on his rabbi's forehead, that word being emet, as though Elias Spector is a golem. He comments, "The secrets are safe with me, Father of my soul, and through them mankind shall be brought to do penance." So he's clearly collecting mystical knowledge. Whoever this guy is, he's afraid of Rabbi Spector's knowledge falling into the hands of anyone who's not wise enough to handle it, which is actually, it goes back to sort of a Talmudic understanding that Jewish mystical knowledge is dangerous, and not everyone is prepared to receive it. There's a long-standing tradition that you're not supposed to study Zohar, the Kabbalistic text, until you are 40 years old. There's also Talmudic edicts that are sort of declaring certain conversation topics, usually of a mystical bent, are not permissible to be taught in front of a large crowd. You can only teach it to one or two other people. So it's in line with this idea that some Jewish knowledge is too dangerous for the common person to have, and like any good villain, Zohar is megalomaniacal enough to believe that only he can inherit these secrets that Rabbi Spector once knew. So we now see Stephen Grant and Marlene at the seminary library, there to meet Rabbi Reuben Davis, and they're chatting with Mr. Weiss, who declares that Mark's father is a world's expert in Kabbalah. Of course, Marlene doesn't know what Kabbalah is, asks what it is. Mark says that he doesn't know. He avoided religious studies. And so on page 13, Mr. Weiss starts explaining Kabbalah. And I was actually wondering, Henry, would you mind reading maybe like a word balloon at a time, and I'll interrupt you to give some commentary?
You see, those initiated in the secret traditions claim to own passwords that open the gates of heaven to the soul searching for its creator.
So amazing. The thing I want to say is, while this is certainly mystical, this is again connected to what I alluded to earlier, Hechalot literature, which was this type of literature that often involved rabbis undergoing meditative ascent, where they would leave their physical bodies and ascend to the heavens and to different levels of the heavens. And there's all these texts. I remember learning in rabbinical school once, learning a work specifically called Hechalot Rabati, or the Greater Palaces, which detailed the ascent of Rabbi Ishmael. And basically, Rabbi Ishmael was surrounded by his pupils, and he would ascend to these levels of heaven, where he'd encounter an angel and learn the angel's name, and the angel would ask for a password. And if he didn't have the right password, he'd be killed on his spot, right in his, right where he was. And he kept acquiring the password and going to the next level. It almost felt like an early rabbinic version of a video game, where it's like, go here, do you have the right password to get past and to get through? This whole genre of literature mostly is found between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, so likely sometime between the 3rd and maybe 8th century or something like that. But honestly, this is the most solid Jewish mysticism we've encountered so far, Henry. Like, the grasp of it, like, this even beats out Rucka's knowledge by far. Oh, yeah. Let's keep going.
Union with God brings great bliss and knowledge, but it can also lead to madness. Some have attempted to wield magic power through Kabbalah to pervert the knowledge of God to selfish ends.
This immediately made me just think, about the rabbinic hesitance to look behind the veil. There's a lot of rabbinic understanding. Even in the Torah itself, you have things like not to go to a soothsayer and don't suffer a witch to live and things like that. And it's not because the Torah,
they don't
right, and it's not because the Torah believes that these things are fake. It's because they believe they're very real.
Yeah.
And God doesn't want you to have that power. Like, God controls everything on that side of things. Don't use magic, don't use necromancy, don't use witchcraft to control things that should be in God's hand. That's the rabbinic concern. And also this idea that it can lead to madness, of course, just made me think of the famous story from Chagiga 14b, Arba Nichnasu Lepardes, 4 men, 4 rabbis entered the orchard, which becomes a euphemism for this sort of mystical garden. Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, the Acher, the other one, and Rabbi Akiva. And it says, Ben Azai looked and died. Ben Zoma looked and went mad. Acher destroyed the plants, which is a euphemistic way of saying that Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, who became known as the other Acher, became an apostate. He stopped believing.
Right.
Only Akiva entered in peace and departed in peace. So, right, that's what's going on here, that like this mystical knowledge can drive you to madness or death. So let's jump ahead to Mr. Weiss's explanation of why someone would try to desecrate a grave.
The soul?
Mm-hmm.
The soul of a dead man, free of the body, journeys to God more easily than a living man's soul. And then he points to the word emet. There are legends suggesting that a soul can be brought back to its dead body by necromancy, and made to utter its knowledge of God to a living Kabbalist.
So basically what we're getting into is there's a distinction between Kabbalah as a intellectual pursuit and a theological understanding of the universe, and something called practical Kabbalah, which is basically, it's essentially magic. Practical Kabbalah is performing these Kabbalistic rituals in order to enact your what's called sympathetic magic, getting God to behave in the way you want God to behave. And of course the rabbis and Kabbalists write about what activities are forbidden and what are permitted, and it's okay to learn about it, but you're not allowed to do it. So clearly he's getting into almost occult-like levels of people actually performing the stuff.
This is the word emet, truth in Hebrew, inscribing it on the forehead of one dead and reciting appropriate spells is believed to bring the breath of life back into its form.
So once again, just like a golem is brought to life and killed, there's this idea that a human body can come back to life. And what I loved about this is, we talked about this with Ragman Henry, the word golem essentially is like lifeless form, right? Golem's word. So what has a body become other than a golem? And so once the soul has departed a body, although we're not made of mud or of clay, our bodies essentially become golemim. We become just husks.
And especially without truth.
Right, without truth. And then when you write the word, you can come back.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Now, is there... obviously, I was very familiar. I was sort of smiling and nodding along when he was pointing to Emet, but I've never heard of this beyond golem. Is there precedent for this? Is there talk in Kabbalah? This kind of, is this how Rabbi Lowe got the idea to do it on a lifeless form? Like, because you could do that hypothetically with a dead body.
So even like the lifeless form, the idea of creating a golem goes back to sort of early texts within Sefer Yetzirah, that for a long time Judaism has had this idea that words can be used to create in the world, because God creates in the creation story in Genesis, God creates the world by speaking it into being. And therefore, the Hebrew alphabet is the DNA of the universe, and if you say the right things, you can create life. So that's long been an idea in a lot of Jewish mystical texts.
Right.
In some of the more esoteric, magical texts, which means some of the texts that, as much as Kabbalah and other Jewish mysticism was frowned upon by some rabbis as sort of foolishness or as like dangerous stuff that you shouldn't get into, there was always Jewish magic that the rabbis disagreed with even more. But there were certainly fringe groups of rabbis practicing magic, and also I think a lot of common people practicing practical Kabbalah and doing this. And in some of that literature, I do believe there is the concept that you could bring a body back to life with the proper spells, and that it would then be able to give you information about what happened in its journey to God. And even before that, I remember studying with a student once, we were diving into a Tannaitic text called Avot de Rebbe Natan. And this did not involve bodies, but it involved a man who goes and discovers these spirits whose bodies were never properly buried. They were sort of lost, and hence the spirits wander around and are just sort of lost, but they know secrets of what's happening, and this man keeps going to where they are to overhear them, to learn basically what's going to happen in the future and when's the best time to grow his crops so that he can be successful while everyone else fails. We don't need to get into the details, but certainly this idea that the dead are privy to knowledge that the living aren't exists in Judaism, and there's some occult materials that seem to suggest if you could bring those souls back to learn those secrets.
Cool. So then on the next page, I just couldn't help but noticing that, what's the name of this guy that's teaching
Mr. Weiss.
Mr. Weiss, is he Commissioner Jim Gordon's twin?
Yes, he is.
Yes, he is. He's his Jewish twin.
Apparently mustaches were big in the 80s.
Yeah.
And as he looks like Commissioner Gordon, he acknowledges that similar to the golem, if you erase the first letter of the word emet, all that's left is met. Or, as this says, meth.
Meth, yeah.
Or dead in Hebrew. And
did the Breaking Bad theme kind of pop in your head?
No, I actually thought about, and so people may or may not know this, there are 6 letters in Hebrew which can have what's called a dagesh kal, which is basically a dagesh is the little dot you'll see in the center of a letter, and it's what makes the difference between when you make a b or a v sound in a bet and a k or ch in a kaf and a p or f in a pei, right? And there are 3 other letters, gimel, daled, and tav, that also can have a dot or not, but we have for the most part lost the traditions of pronouncing them differently. However, some of them exist. For example, in a lot of Ashkenazi communities, they will pronounce a taf without the dagesh as a sav. Hence why you'll hear someone saying, yiskadal, yiskadash, etc. But there's also a lot of communities that, for whatever reason, view a taf with a dagesh as a t sound, and a taf without the dagesh as a th sound, or a th. Hence why, if you belong to a synagogue that is Beth anything, I grew up at Beth Knesset Bamidbar, right in Evanston there's a Beth Emet, etc. That is just the Hebrew word beit, house, but since the taf doesn't have a dagesh, it's a th. So similarly, I guess it's really maith, right? Because it's the word mate, dead, with a th. So I'm so steeped in that Hebrew grammar that it didn't strike me as meth at all.
No, of course not. I knew exactly what was going on.
Yeah. Mr. Weiss goes off to lecture a class of his on Kabbalah, and Marlene goes to join along, which is really fun. She's really interested in learning more, while our hero, Mark Spector or Stephen Grant, goes to the seminary chapel to meet with Rabbi Davis, or so he thinks, but instead of Reuben Davis being there, he discovers Zohar, who shows up saying, "It is written, a wayward and rebellious son shall be put to death, that you might rid yourselves of evil in your midst." I never in my life thought that we would get a Jewish reference in a comic book to the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the wayward and rebellious son, which is this famous legal category of a child who rebels against their parents and is put to death. The rabbis were just as uncomfortable with it as I'm sure you are. This is from Deuteronomy 21, verse 18. And in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin 68b, it basically bends over backwards to limit what qualifies as a wayward and rebellious son, such that it can only happen in like a very narrow window of time. Because on the one hand, the son has to at least be 13 years old, because they have to be bound by mitzvot. So any younger than 13, they can't qualify. And it basically defines it as Mishayavi Shte Sa'arot V'ad Sheyakif Zaken Hatachton. From when he first grows 2 pubic hairs until the point where he grows a lower beard. In other words, till he has pubic hair. The rabbis are not afraid to get dirty. But just like, again, it's this famous halakhic legal category, this famous example. This controversial concept that, again, the rabbis bend over backwards to basically assure us that there really never was a Ben Sorer Umoreh.
Tradition tells us it never happened.
It never happened. We never ever kill a child for being disobedient this way. And here he is quoting it. And it's just kind of, and that's how you know this guy's villainous, because he's like, you are a Ben Sorer Umoreh. I must put you to death. Like, wow. But like, I would expect this out of like a comic book coming from Chabad or something like that.
And from a twisted villain perspective, Mark Spector certainly is a rebellious son. He rebelled against his father.
He leaves his rabbi father to go become a mercenary, killing people for money. Like, 100%. Zohar then goes on to once again quote Isaiah 118, talking about cleansing sinners through punishment, and Mark has this moment of like, wait a minute, I've heard this quote before from Reuben Davis's eulogy. And of course, as you've probably picked up by now, Reuben Davis, the rabbi, the student, is the supervillain Zohar. This is the part where I wanted to get into the background of the Isaiah quote, though. The verses immediately before all that bit about being, white and whitening your sins. Isaiah 1:15-17 says, "And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen." In other words, God is not going to hear what you have to say. God's going to purposely ignore you. Your hands are stained with crime, right? Because you have broken the law. Wash yourselves clean, put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow. That's like a pretty awesome set of things to do, right? Like, defend the orphan and the widow and the stranger, do justice, do all these. And then that's when we get into the quote that Zohar's saying, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. In other words, it's not too late. You might have done wrong, but as long as you start doing good now, you will be forgiven. You will earn redemption. Zohar, however, is taking it in a different direction, that being the direction of you can only be redeemed through suffering, right? There is this idea in Judaism that teshuvah can work to redeem you. Zohar's going to go on in a couple pages to say, for the suffering Zohar inflicts upon your body, your soul will be redeemed. There is a rabbinic concept that one of the ways that you earn redemption is through suffering, and that in fact, if you don't suffer enough in this world, you'll have to suffer in the world to come in order to be able to get the reward that you're going to receive afterwards. And this is where the concept of Gehenna, or sort of Jewish hell, eventually develops, that you go to this place of suffering in order to purify yourself of those misdeeds. So I disagree with him, obviously, but I do think Zohar believes in himself as fulfilling God's will. Do you want to say anything about Zohar, Henry?
Yeah, so first of all, such a cool supervillain thing to refer to your supervillain name, refer to yourself in the third person.
Yeah.
He goes, "Now Zohar shall see you atone." Like, that's cool supervillain stuff,
it's prime supervillain, yeah.
How did you feel about the rabbi being a supervillain? The rabbi who was like doing vidui with a dying person at the beginning and now is a villain.
I think I'm okay with it for a few reasons.
Okay.
One, Mr. Weiss and all the other rabbinical students we're going to see are clearly good people, and like the issue projects them in a good light. It's very obvious that Mark's father is a good rabbi, right, and is doing great things. And so the idea that you've got this one person who was so jealous of the biological connection, right? Like his esteemed teacher who he feels was wronged by his son, right? It's
you don't
corrupt
deserve to be him.
I should be his son.
Yeah.
I should be the inheritor of all this. And we know in Judaism, especially in Hasidic Judaism, there are these dynasties where the rabbi's son takes on as the next leader. So I could definitely see how his petty desires sort of get in the way. And I found it a very believable motivation. And I guess it gets back to a topic we've talked about a lot, which is representation.
Yeah.
If Rabbi Reuben Davis was the only rabbi in this entire story, I'd probably be uncomfortable with him being a villain.
Yeah.
But the fact that we have Mark's father as a sweet, good rabbi, the fact that we have the Skokie Yeshiva and all of its students and faculty presented in a good way, and the fact that we have Mark slowly coming to terms with, like, maybe Judaism's not so bad sort of thing, like, all of it balanced is just like, yeah, I do... Guess what? I do think there's some Jews out there that are jerks and schmucks and that do terrible things in the name of Judaism.
Yeah.
And because he is not the only Jewish character we have in the story, I am okay with one of those Jewish characters being a villain.
I wasn't sure when I asked the question how I felt, and now I feel okay. So thank
Great.
you. I mean, because
Glad
it was,
to hear
is this Shylock, from
right,
Mission
yes,
Event.
yeah.
Like I was watching The Irishman last night, and, the mobsters in Scorsese movies are constantly, using all sorts of derogatory terms for every single ethnicity, including Jews. And, and so at one point I was watching with someone and they referred to, so he was Shylocking so-and-so, meaning he was running the books, something having to do with money, of course. And I had to explain that to the person I was watching it with, why that's a derogatory term. And so I'm always like, sensitive to this, like, oh, great, a Jewish villain. What is this? Are we reading Shakespeare?
Right,
sure. But I didn't have that initial feeling. I felt like, oh, this is actually done really well. So I guess, you explaining that nuance to it is helpful.
Not to mention, it's a Jewish writer writing it.
Yeah, of
which
course.
I think all of this sort of adds together. So Zohar and Mark have a fight. I want to just point out, there's a really cool panel where Zohar ends up shattering a stained glass window over Mark Spector, and apparently Zohar thinks that it kills him because he says, "And thus do you perish, sinner, but I must hasten, there are others who must be scourged." So he goes off to continue his work. Then we cut to the lecture that Mr. Weiss is giving on page 18, giving his lecture on Kabbalah and pointing to the Sephirotic tree, an image drawn very similar to the one in Batwoman, except this one has the names of all 10 Sefirot. And here's what I love about it, Henry. It has the names, it has them accurate, but you may notice second Sefira to the right, which is usually, so not Chokhmah being the first, because Keter's in the middle, Chokhmah's to the right,
should be
and then
Gevurah.
the one below that, no, Gevurah's on the left side. Okay. The one to the right normally would be represented as Chesed or Rachamim, right? It would be God's mercy or loving kindness. But what word do we have there, Henry?
Gedula?
Yes, we have Gedula, God's greatness, right? Which normally we would say it's Chesed. But I love the fact that it's Gedula for two reasons. Number one, across from it on the left side, we have Gevurah, God's strength, which is often used to describe, like I said, that Sefirah is often called either Din, judgment, or judgment, or Gevurah, strength, right? So, just on a linguistic level, Gedula and Gevurah sound very similar, so they're a balanced pair. B, there's the fact that Gevurah, God's strength, is carried out through God's judgment and abilities, but Gedula, God's greatness, is God's mercy, right? That God's acting merciful is what's so great about God. And then my final one, my favorite one, and I have to thank my teacher, Professor Sharon Corrin, for teaching us this in, I think, my third year of rabbinical school, as she pointed out how the Kabbalists found some of the Sefirot. There is a verse from 1 Chronicles 29:11 that if you go to Shabbat morning services, I promise is familiar to you, because we will take the Torah out of the ark and we'll march it around and we will sing Lecha Adonai HaGedula v'HaGevura v'HaTiferet
v'hanetzach v'hahod.
Those are the first 5 of the lower Sefirot. They're right there in that verse, and that's what the Kabbalists played with. It's just, again, chesed, right? God's mercy is not called mercy, it's called gedula. So it goes right back to the biblical verse. That's why I'm totally okay with it being gedula here.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That was great.
I smiled so wide when I saw this.
That's so good.
And thank you again, Sharon Corn. I will never forget that lesson. She taught it in this way. I can't remember how, but it was very much like as we're talking and reading, she just starts writing certain words that people were saying on the board in an order where it slowly dawned on us, oh my God, she's drawing the Sefirot. It was amazing. Mr. Weiss goes on to lecture and say, it is a fundamental belief among Kabbalists that the Tetragrammaton and other secret names of God are the most powerful tools for conjuring occult forces and commanding nature itself. Yes, amazing. And then we cut to Marlene's inner monologue where she says, I haven't been this fascinated since I first learned hieroglyphics to accompany my father's expedition to the Sudan. I love it. And I also love that her thought ties back into that tension of Mark Spector being a Jewish character with ties to Egypt. Yeah. And I love that you have this woman who studies Egyptian hieroglyphics being wow, Jewish mythology is just as rich, just as fascinating, and just as stimulating as this Egyptian mythology that I thought was I love it. It doesn't happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was the start of a great love affair between Marlene and Jewish thought.
I was going to ask you, does she ever convert to Judaism or anything like that?
No, and I don't think I need her to.
No, of course not.
But
I'm saying,
I love the idea that she's knowledgeable about and engaged in Judaism in this way.
About to become a Judeophile.
Right, exactly. So Zohar bursts in, he's threatening everybody, he's citing verses from Proverbs 10 about violence filling the mouth of the wicked, the fool following, etc. On page 24, after an extended... Basically, Zohar attacks the students and goes running out, and Mark dresses up as Moon Knight and also goes rushing out, hoping to catch Zohar back at home. Zohar gets shot by a police officer and escapes. Moon Knight rushes off to meet to Rabbi Davis's home. They encounter each other, and in their battle, Moon Knight ends up using a mirror to defeat Zohar by reflecting the blast back at him. I love the idea of Zohar perhaps confronted with the reflection of who he has become. That is what defeats him on an allegorical scale. That's what's going on. And as he falls down on the top of page 25, Zohar mumbles, "You'll not defeat Zohar, master of divine illumination, father of my soul. I, who have slain the evil son of your loins, call thee up against this stranger with the charmed vowels of the Tetragrammaton, Kel Shaddai." Oh, so he's babbling out these letters. He's performing the practical magic. But I love, El Shaddai, a name of God, commonly used, is not the Tetragrammaton, but it seems to be he's saying, I'll use the vowels of the Tetragrammaton. But I love that written out. Henry, what are you freaking out about?
All right, so number one, El Shaddai, that's a very old biblical name of God. God reveals God's self to Moses as Kel Shaddai, as El Shaddai, and in Kabbalistic, it's also sometimes thought of as the motherly name of God, because Shaddai, like Shaddayim, are breasts, and perhaps it's the more nurturing name of God, like the one who created the universe from birthing it. Right. Anyway, but in religious Judaism, you not only don't write out the name of God, if you're not using the name of God in prayer or in reading Torah, like actually learning Torah, you use a different consonant in the place of a vowel, so that you're not saying a name of God unnecessarily. So, for example, we say Baruch Atah Hashem, the name, instead of Baruch Atah Adonai.
Right.
If we're not saying the bracha,
and instead of saying Eloheinu, our God, we would often say Elokeinu.
So you put in a hard consonant in the place of a hey. So often, even though El Shaddai is it's not obscure, but it's not used in.
It doesn't seem to be a word that has a name of God that is imbued with the same holiness as,
because it's not in any kind of brachot. But I do remember when I learned about it in Orthodox Day School, the rabbis would say Kel Shaddai.
Right. Right.
And it was one of those things, by the way, those are totally those things that were not explained in the way that I just explained it, and you just kind of...
You just had to pick it up by osmosis, And very clearly...
So that's so cool that
it's so
the
cool.
writer puts that in there because he doesn't want to write...
Yes, exactly, even though it's in English. Between that and the cover, it's like amazing the respect that's being given. It's great. Unfortunately, Rabbi Elias Spector's corpse, having heard those magic words recited, rises up, and Elias goes to choke his own son, which, like, God, it's terrifying, the thought of your estranged father rising up as like from the dead to come after you. Like,
great image too of just his head with just the whites of his eyes, no pupils, and it says Emet on his forehead.
Right. Honestly, it doesn't even look like it's the whites of his eyes. It looks like his eyeballs are missing, and it's just pure light, illumination coming out of him. He goes to attack Mark Spector, and we have this beautiful, on the bottom of the next page, Mark is just allowing his father to choke him, thinking, I'll die before I ever lay my hands on him again, I swear it. Moon Knight has performed Shuvah. He's not going to dishonor his father again. He's not going to fight back. He's finally in the position that his father was in. Dad, why didn't you fight back against those people that were trying to kill you?
Right.
He's not going to do it. And then, of course, Marlene comes in and saves him. And how does Marlene save Moon Knight? What does she do?
She erases the aleph, as she learned from Mr. Weiss, that if you erase the aleph, you'll just get mate or meth.
Right.
Maze, which means death. And the rabbi schlumps over, and as it says, she's thinking... it's just as Weiss described it. I have to erase that Hebrew letter to send the corpse back to its ... death.
Right.
Do you think that zombie Rabbi Dad here knows, because he's strangling Mark in his Moon Knight costume, do you think he knows it's Mark Spector, or do you think that somehow Zohar, sent this corpse to attack his enemy?
Zohar doesn't know that it's Mark Spector, right? Because Zohar's saying as he's falling, right, I killed your son. He thinks that he has killed Mark Spector, right? He thinks Moon Knight is just some other guy. I don't think...
You think that? So do you think the corpse senses that it's his son?
No, I think the corpse is just following... Zohar's commands.
Okay.
I think it's become a golem-like creature.
Okay.
So on the last page, Mark and Marlene are leaving, and it's really interesting that Mark says at the end, this whole issue in part has been about him maybe abandoning the Mark Spector identity, and he says. I think Mark Spector has at last succeeded laying to rest the bitterness of his past and reconciling with his father's memory. I think I found a peace of mind I never knew before, almost feel like a new person. To which Marlene responds, the last thing we need is a new person, Stephen. Mark. Moon Knight. Look, whoever you are, I'm happy for you. I really am. And I love it because not only is it a line about Moon Knight's multiple personalities or multiple guises, but this idea that he feels like a new person. Again, I really do think that Alan Zelenetz intended for this to be tshuva for Mark Spector, because it made me think of Maimonides and Maimonides' laws of repentance in Hilchot Tshuva 2:4. One of the things that Maimonides writes is, among the paths of repentance is for the penitent to change his name as if to say, I am a different person and not the same one who sinned. And now we have Moon Knight reflecting he feels like he's a new person, not the one who sinned against his father all those years ago. And he has so many new names. But there's this Jewish concept that, like, one of the ways you show gratitude for surviving a difficult experience, or one of the ways that you indicate that you're different and you've really changed your act, is by changing your name. I think it's beautiful. It's written in. And what do you know? This is the last issue of the original Moon Knight series.
Really?
As far as I know, I think this is the end.
Wow, right. I didn't know that. This was great. I mean, it's... We talked about this a little bit with Ragman, but this was even more so for me. I think also because we spent a long period of time over Ragman, a couple months, but this was the first time in a long time I picked up a comic book that I knew nothing about other than the Jewish connections, obviously, and so I didn't. I mean, you really cultivated which ones we were gonna look at, but and enjoyed it. like on all levels, storytelling, art, explicitly Jewish content, everything. This was a really, really, really good, well-written comic. Do we know how many issues he wrote?
Alan Zelenetz?
Yeah.
It looked like he came in, I think he didn't write any more than like 6 or so.
Okay.
So it seems like really few. And for right now, I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No relation.
Join us next time for our thrilling conclusion to Moon Knight. We'll be looking at Moon Knight number 194 from 2016. You can follow us on Twitter at Jewish Comics Pod, on Facebook at Jewish Comics Pod, and you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.